Hello there and welcome. My name is Osman Butt. I'm a video producer with Middle East Monitor. I'd like to welcome all of you to our discussion today. Joining me today is Javaad Alipoor. He is a British-Iranian theatre director and playwright. He has produced a number of plays, including touring with his current play called Rich Kids, which tells the story of two young struck lovers in Iran who are also Instagrammers who unfortunately don't make it. Javaad, welcome to the Middle East Monitor Live.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, who are the rich kids? This page, the Rich Kids of Tehran, this is an Instagram page, right? Could you tell us who are these? Who are the rich kids of Tehran? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I mean, obviously, I'm a political theatre maker, a political filmmaker, political artist, let's say, and so obviously for me, who those people are related to why I want to tell a story about them. So there's an Instagram page and there's an Instagram hashtag, which is part of a whole milieu of hashtags, Rich Kids of Tehran. Our show, Rich Kids, which is subtitled The History of Shopping Malls in Tehran, is about a particular subset of these kids. Now, it's also about Instagram and the nature of how pictures work. It's also about colonialism and the climate change issue and so on. But what's interesting to me about these kinds of like rich kids of Iran is that to tell their stories, to put your finger on a contradiction, not only at the heart of the Iranian regime, but the heart of similar regimes, similar orders throughout the global south, particularly regimes which would present themselves as ideologically, if you like, anti-imperialist in character, and largely the result of either some sort of popular revolution or anti-colonial struggle of some sort. So, as viewers may know, a bit about the history of Iran and stuff. One of the sort of interesting quirks of Iranian politics is that it doesn't matter how much money you have, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, it doesn't matter how much money you have squirreled away in a Swiss bank account. It's political suicide to show your money off. And this is all clearly to do with the kind of ideological framework of the country, which I would imagine largely comes from the fact that it's a regime that comes to power off a popular revolution. And so you have these very stern, very severe men who, however rich they are, however much power and money they have, however much they've coined from the sanctions, they don't flash that cash. Now, the problem is that they have children. And their children do that, and their children do that on Instagram. And for some reason, Instagram is one of the few bits of social media not censored in Iran. So as you can imagine, this leads to all kinds of social problems. As I say, it's not just limited to Iran. So in Zimbabwe, the Mugabe regime had a similar problem. Just before, we talk about this in the show, just before the coup d'etat against Mugabe, his youngest son, I think, Chatunga, no one tricked him into doing this. He did this off his own bat. There was no journalist, there was no spies, nothing like that. He was, just like in Iran, horrendous sanctions are crippling the economy. People don't have access to basic medicines, chicken, tomatoes. And Mugabe's son is in a nightclub in South Africa, surrounded by young women. And he himself gets his friend to make a video of him, where he flashes his watch to, like, if you imagine this is the camera of the phone, he flashes his watch to the camera like this. Unlike my watch, his watch is a $25,000 Rolex. He then opens a $500 bottle of Bollinger champagne, and then slowly pours it over the watch, breaking the watch. He then puts that on social media and hashtags it, "Daddy runs the whole country." And which obviously does not go down hugely well in middle class and working class parts of Iran. Now, similar things been going on in Iran. Similar stories you can tell about the children of the Chinese elite. The Chinese elite have a problem with their daughters going shopping in Paris and that stuff coming on social media. And for me, what's really, as a political artist, like in England, we have this tradition of people talking about, we talk about the great political playwrights writing state of the nation plays. And I suppose I've always wanted to write state of the world plays. And I think focusing on this specific kind of the elite in a very specific kind of country allows us to tell an international story, which is on one hand politically really important because it's about the growing gap between the rich and the poor that affects us all around the world. It's about let us say, the unraveling the dreams of the nationalist uprisings of the global South and the problems we see around that all around the world. And finally, it makes for really, really good stories, because that idea of, one of the things going on in Iran at the minute is a kind of a generational crisis of the regime revivifying itself with a new kind of cadre for all kinds of complicated reasons. You only have to look at like pictures of the Majlis al-Khubragan, the Assembly of Experts in English. You only have to look at the picture of that upper chamber in Iran to see these are largely men in their 90s who can't stay awake anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's laughable. And so you end up with this section of young men who grow up in tremendous privilege, whose fathers didn't grow up in that privilege, whose fathers were of a different kind. And you end up with this story that's a super classic bit of storytelling that goes, what happens if you are, high up in the Chinese Communist Party, if you're Robert Mugabe, if you're a commander of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, and you are a hard, brutal man who, whatever we think about the politics and the morality of it, has carved himself out a bit of power in the world. And then you bring up this son who's coddled in that power. And actually that story is a classic story. Like, if you know the Godfather movies, it's the story of Fredo in the first two Godfather movies.
Yes.
Also the story of Prince Hal in Henry IV. So yeah, that's why I think that's a key story for people to be telling.
Yes, it's very interesting. And also you mentioned in the play that there is this term now coined for these people called Algazadeh. And I also believe there's a television show about it as well. So could you tell us a little bit about this term?
Yes, this is super interesting, man. So like the Persian word for prince Farsi word for prince is Shahzadeh. And so as a sort of joke about that, one of the ironically disrespectful words you can call a cleric in Iran is like agha, I mean, there's worse words than that people use as well. Like an agha as in a powerful guy, do you know what I mean? And specifically the aghas of this regime are clearly the guys who sit at the nexus of power in Iran. The nexus of power largely involves having a link to the Revolutionary Guard, having a link to the traditional Bazari economy, and having a link to international capitalism. You know what I mean? There you go. That makes you ruling class there. So the aghas are these guys. So there's this kind of like punning name, this playful name to, if you like, mock their sons, just like in English you might say a princeling, like a little guy on your right dad's coattail. So rather than Shahzadeh, you say Aghazadeh, like a mullaling or something like this. Now, what's interesting is the vicissitudes of this word in terms of cultural production in Iran. So one of the first times I heard the word was through an underground hip hop tune called Aghazadeh by Gadal, which is hilarious. Now, clearly, like a lot of countries in the region, the nature of the Iranian economy means that family connections are as important to business affairs as, let's just say, competencies. And so there's a section of there's a whole kind of cultural metaphor in Iran about these young men being a metaphor for that kind of incompetence of people who get jobs or people who have power because of who their father is. And Gadal's tune is hilarious. I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't really work in English, but to give an example, like, these guys will often be, as I say, from a social class who were not elite in the Shah's time, are elite now, and sort of sit at this nexus between traditional with loads of money, whatever that's supposed to mean, traditional with loads of money, and then just loads of money in the same way you have loads of money in LA and wherever you like. Do you know what I mean? And in Gadal's tune, he has one of the lines he has that always cracks me up about that. He says in Persian, he says basically what it means is he talks about a young man who's changed his name from a more traditionally Shia name to a more sort of international Iranian inflected name, and he says oh, what's up with you? You've become so handsome. Do you know what I mean? Your hair's got better, as in he's had hair implants, and Ali Reza has become Donyal or whatever, and that felt really fresh. And it felt really, it's difficult making those records in Iran, and that's not the kind of record that would be coming with a stamp from the Ministry of Culture. What's interesting is how this word now has been jumped on in the factional disputes within the regime. So actually, like now, reformist and conservative, or clearly reformists aren't really allowed to operate in Iran anymore, but let's say centrists and conservatives will fire this charge at each other. So, you know, I mean, Ahmadinejad will say, Rafsanjani's son is an Aghazadeh. The centrists might say the Larijani's sons are Aghazadehs. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's now been taken up as a factional thing.
Yes, and to move on, so in the actual play itself, we follow the fates of two young lovers, as I mentioned in the intro, who are obviously part of the country's revolutionarily in that they are the children of them. Could you tell us a bit more about them and why their story, what's interesting about their story?
Yeah, for sure, man. So we follow a fictionalized version of a real story about two actual people, Hossein Rabbani Shirazi and Parivash Akbarzadeh. Hossein Rabbani Shirazi was the grandson of one of the few Ayatollahs. So quick plotted history that I'm sure viewers are aware of. Most of the clergy didn't support Khomeini before the revolution. Khomeini was perceived as an outsider with crazy ideas, blah, blah, blah. A revolutionary, let's say, do you know what I mean? to be clear. And then, so Shirazi, Ayatollah Shirazi was one of the few people who supported Khomeini early on. He was like a patriotic hero, kind of all this kind of stuff. Rabbani Shirazi's father, you know, many tours of duty in the war with Iraq and so on. Rabbani Shirazi grows up in a very different world. His father's hugely rich, what have you, you know, holidays in Dubai, Antalya, LA, all this stuff. And Rabbani Shirazi was this goes back to about 2017, I think, it was the first occurrence. It's been a while since I performed the show, so not in my head. And Rabbani Shirazi was found dead in a Porsche crash, lying in a yellow Porsche at the height of the sanctions, you know, in a car full of empty drugs bags and empty Bollinger bottles, the ubiquitous Bollinger bottles of these people, in a country which is obviously in principle a dry country. How much it is in practice is a different question entirely. Found dead next to this young woman from a much more lower middle class background, Parivash Akbarzadeh, who was the young woman he was cheating on his fiancée with. This blew up on Iranian social media. If you think back to 2017, that was one of the years where there was a series of, let's say, you know, riots, insurrections, however you want to chop it up, around Iran. And I was struck, I was following the story of this, and there was a wonderful long read about it in the New York Times, and it ended with this quote from a young guy who worked in the bazaar in a provincial small town in the south. So not a part of the country that was hugely active in the revolutionary period. Do you know what I mean? But he had this wonderful line where he said, they tell us that we're all in this together. They tell us that the sanctions are hurting everyone. But he said, I'm not an idiot and I've got Instagram. And that really struck me. Now, it's almost, so this became a bit of a controversy in Iran, as you can imagine. And Rabbani Shirazi's Instagram account was taken down. In Iran, a lot of their stuff was filtered from the internet and so on. And so I suppose the kind of writer I am, the kind of artist I am, I'm very interested in what, for me, I think one of what's really important if you're a political artist is to be clear about what the point of political art is. And for me, political art is different to being a political activist. And one of the ways in that is that as an artist, you can bring the imagination to bear more, and you can take things that feel intellectual and make them more playful and of the heart and of the guts. And so the fact that this story was real, but was expunged from the internet, gave us an excuse, if you like, to say, well, this Instagram account has disappeared. What happens if we remake it to tell a story? So we make this fictional Instagram account, and we ask the question, what would happen if this Instagram account, rather than going back through, you know, if you click on a picture on Instagram and you scroll down, you go back through someone's life. So the idea was, what happens if this Instagram feed is magical? And rather than just going back through someone's life, it can go all the way back to tell you the roots of the story and how this world came to be. So that's why we wanted to tell the story of those young people, really.
Yes. On the question before I go back to the play, The actual account itself, though, is still running, isn't it? The Rich Kids of Tehran, because
Yeah,
I see them.
certainly, like there's a Rich Kids of Tehran account. Those hashtags exist as well. What I mean is Muhammad Hossein Rabbani
Oh,
Shiraz
right.
gone.
Yeah, because I actually do have a question about them specifically, which I didn't put in, but because one of the things I've noticed is they have a tendency towards, say, for example, they say, well, let's uncover how the Iranian elite are living. So, for example, they say this is the son of a minister, and then they'll have pictures of all his daughters or whatever and stuff. And I find that weird because I thought that's the elite they come from. So, what's going on there?
So, could you ask that question again?
So it feels like there's this obviously I think the account that I saw the other day was that they seem to be quite anti-regime, and they're targeting specific ministers and their children, and then just posting pictures without their permission.
Yeah.
Don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I've seen some of some of this stuff just goes viral. I mean, obviously, like if you kind of follow Iranian, I think it's the nature of any country with a lot of censorship. That there'll often be, especially in the days of social media, there'll often be, to what sometimes in some sense quite murky, but nevertheless a lot of organic, just counter media. Do you know what I mean? So like, the various kinds of like Iranian news Telegram chats that I follow, to be frank with you, of greatly varying quality, and in fact, of varying levels of sanity, to be very clear. For instance, one thing that went viral there was, there was a famous video of Ahmadinejad's son on holiday in Dubai. I think what the point that's being made here is an interesting one, because I think we get to the heart of this question of like, I suppose in some ways I'm still a recovering Marxist, and I think it's interesting that like a lot of the chat we have about a lot of political criticism of various kinds of countries and regimes, in the UK in its own way. We talk about corruption now a lot. Do you know what I mean? That seems to be a thing people focus on. Do you know what I mean? Now, I don't want to sound, as I say, I don't want to sound like some old-fashioned Marxist and say, well, actually, comrades, you think about exploitation. But I do sort of think that. Do you know what I mean? I do sort of think that.
I won't say it, but I think it. I'll just give you that look. Yeah. But it's interesting because they're exposing, it's not so much that the official, one of the accounts I'm looking at, which is the Rich Kids of Tehran, at least it's under that hashtag, is basically going through people's private information and just releasing it by the looks of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be clear, like this show, my show isn't about that account. Do you know what I mean? To be clear, like it's about some rich kids from Iran. Do you know what I mean? If you like, and I mean, I can see why that's the case, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's interesting why we made this show. I mean, look, part of it is I have Iranian heritage, and so and I have English heritage, so that's one way of trying to tell a story about the whole world. Do you know what I mean? In the sense of the world is made up of specific places. But there's a reason why you want to tell this story about Iran and not Saudi Arabia. Do you know what I mean? Because if I go Rich Kids of Saudi Arabia, everyone goes, well, I know. Do you know what I mean? I know. Whereas if you say Rich Kids of Zimbabwe, Rich Kids of Iran, there's something interesting about the obvious hypocrisy of the distinction between the official ideology and that level of kind of corruption and carrying on from the children, I think.
But you mentioned in the play that the count is suing you or tried to sue you.
Yeah, well, there's, the show, as I say, we were there, certainly, yeah. I don't know who's running that account now, but when the original Rich Kids of Tehran account, which kind of collected lots of rich kids from Tehran stuff, yeah, they weren't happy on us using the phrase "Rich Kids of Tehran." So yeah, which is as you say, we play within the show. As I say, the kind of writer I am and the kind of artist I am, I really like being on that line between what's true and what's not, because I think that allows us to do something which is different to me writing an article about something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I found when I viewed the play, it was very interesting because on the one hand, you're going through the story of this couple and you're sort of going back through time, and you're also dealing with things to do with Iranian history, but you're also talking about other things. Like you talk about the, tooth study done, or atomic tooth study. You're talking about nuclear testing in the US in the 60s and 50s, and you're talking about all these other things, including that weird shopping mall trend that's on YouTube. So my question partly is, what connects all of this together?
I think really what connects all this together is like the big political, and this will seem like a weird segue, but what connects that stuff together for me is this is a show which is fundamentally about our relationship to history and what that means, what it means to think of yourself as a historical sort of figure. Like in the same way that it's very easy for me to look at, the behavior of these kids in Tehran, Ahmadinejad's son or Mugabe's son, and just go, what is wrong with you, man? What is wrong with you? How can you not see that your father came to power? Your father, where does daddy's money come from? Daddy's money comes from the fact that he came to power on the back of a revolution against what? Against an out of touch and hated westernized elite. Now, what do you think is going to happen if you carry on acting this way? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen? So I look at those people and I think, how is it possible for you to live so obviously ignorant of the historical context in which you live? But actually, when we think about these issues, the issues that haunt us most right now in the world, issues of climate, anthropogenic climate change, issues of post-coloniality, these kinds of questions. This is precisely the difficulty of locating yourself in history, is precisely the thing that we lack. So we talk about in the show, I say, I buy this computer, this computer will take about 24,000 years to kind of biodegrade or whatever it's called. Now, so in a way, I'm responsible for this for 24,000 years. Now, that's not eternity. It's very long but specific amount of time. And the question of climate change is full of these challenges. Do you know what I mean? The questions of political questions today are full of these challenges. Like, as human beings, I think we're very good at operating on two, again, we talk about this in the show, we're good at operating on these two levels. Either me, my parents, my grandparents, me, my children, my grandchildren, or eternity. Obviously Prophet Muhammad, Buddha, Plato, whatever you like. But these very specific, like we talk about, in the show, like when we take oil from the ground, we need to think about what is going to happen to that for the next 750 years, or when we make plastic from it, the next 24,000 years. So really, forgive me, that's a very verbose way of saying the show is about our relationship to history and what it means to be a historical actor.
And moving on to art, because you've mentioned a lot of things about using art to sort of explore these ideas. I'm wondering, though, I know your show, from my perspective of your show, you're trying to ask wider questions that can be asked anywhere. It's not just about these regimes, it can be asked about the UK, there are stuff around other countries. But I'm wondering about Iran specifically. How can we use this kind of theatre to explore Iranian politics? What does it do?
Well, I think what it's not is I would say two things about that. The first thing I would say is that I think as someone who lives in the West, who lives in the global North, I think there are many interesting conversations going on about race, about minorities and so on in the global North. Obviously galvanized largely by the Black Lives Matter movement, but with other things in the mix as well. One of the things people here people in the US and Europe and so on aren't so good at doing, I think, is overcoming the Eurocentrism that's in our bones. So there's that even those of us on the liberal left can be comfortable with there being ethnic diversity, racial diversity where we are, but we still sort of struggle with the fact that, most people are Indian or Chinese, and this kind of understanding, what used to be called the idea of provincializing Europe. So for me, I think my work largely tours to Europe, North America, these places. So one of the things I hope to do is bring a view to these questions, which just because I happen to be Iranian means I think about Iran, but actually some of my biggest influences are like apart from Iranian cinema artists, like, you know, various Syrian playwrights, various Indian cultural theorists, these kinds of things. So I suppose I'm trying to bring, do my own little bit about bringing a view to Western theatre where it's not the West and the rest. And obviously that entails a commitment to, on the one hand, that entails a commitment to not just making things up, do you know what I mean? Not just dealing in the realm of stereotype. I sometimes joke that in England, people in England, in the West, there's two kinds of Iran. There's two kinds of, you know, Middle East, let's say, broadly. One kind is the obvious one, the obvious like racist, savagery, barbarism, blah, 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 you know, terrorists, whatever. And then there's a sort of breathless Simon Sharma, glories, the glories of whatever you like, Palmyra, the Persian Empire, the glories, do you know what I mean? But the actual like messy nonsense of the lived experience of actual life doesn't fit anywhere in those. So again, I hope that's another thing that I bring to the mix.
I feel like that should be a show. Simon Sharma explores Instagram. The glories of this filters. I feel like that
shouldn't be too brutal. He's actually got some good programs, man. He's an easy sort of target.
Yeah. You know I mean? He is quite an easy target, and I do feel sorry for him sometimes. But then other times you would sit there watching him and like, yeah, you pretty much brought that on yourself there.
Well, I mean, to be brutal, and this isn't brutal against Simon Sharma. This is brutal against actually other people. But like, to be clear, like, you know, we were talking, you know, we obviously know each other from social media, and we were chatting about, you know, whatever program it was about Iranian archaeology or whatever that the BBC made.
Oh, Samira Ahmed.
Yeah, Samira Ahmed made. And Samira Ahmed, cool. She's trying to tell a story, fine. But then, you know, absolutely unexamined, we just get a narrative told by these like incredibly elite, do you know what I mean? Like 5 generations of being salaried upper middle class Iranians, largely based at SOAS, which is unexamined, tell you to give you a historiography, which is the shared nationalist core of both the Pahlavi regime and, you know, the Islamic Republic. And you just think, there's got to be more to things than this, man. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it sparked an interesting conversation online because there was a degrading of art that wasn't Iranian as well. So, I mean, there's always a question around that about, are we talking about Persian civilization, which goes beyond present-day Iran? Or are we talking about Iran, in which case we have to talk about Arab, Turk, and all these other influences? Yeah. But yeah, it didn't really happen in that show. It was...
I mean, for me, one of the books that's really changed my thinking is Shahab Ahmed's book, What is Islam? I don't know if you've come across that.
Yeah, I know that book.
And he talks about the Balkans to Bengal complex, and this, you know, the kind of, broadly speaking, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal cultural world where, you know, it's interesting, and you know, Iranian cultural, you know, Iranian civil society and artistic life certainly it would be great if more thought was put into, if you like, provincializing Iran in the Persianate or Iranianate world. But that's a whole other chat.
We'll do a whole one on that. And lastly from me here, so as you know, this year, this is the election year in Iran. And as we've seen previously, social media is obviously very big in Iran, and arguably in 2018, the protests we saw in Iran and so on wouldn't have happened without social media in many ways, or at least it was where people drew some of their grievance from when they saw how everyone else is living. So in terms of the fact that this is an election year, how do you see it playing out with social media in this election?
I think that's a really good question. I think the big challenge, as far as I see, I think the big challenge is that, and people, sometimes this is a controversial position, but I think, you know, the Islamic Republic has been to some degree democratic since its foundation. Do you know what I mean? There is huge debate and questions to be asked over the degrees at various stages, but it's been democratic in some way. But one can certainly see from the 80s to now an opening, but then a very rapid closing down of the possibilities of open democratic discourse. You know, for instance, now, obviously, you know, Khatami isn't allowed to be shown. You know, he's mamnul tasvir, they call it in Persian. You know, he's forbidden to be broadcast. And this man used to be president. Do you know what I mean? So obviously that the boundary of legitimate discourse gets further and further broken down, to the point where, as I was saying earlier, there is no open reformist sort of candidate or whatever running for a lot of things. I think what that then does is, you know, largely open up social media in the same contradictory and complicated way that it does in the West, but with the added complication of, you know, more dictatorial measures over censorship and so on. So on the one hand, it opens up as a space where unofficial organization is possible. You can see, for example, the role that Telegram played in the, let's say, uprising of last year. This year's been terrible, so I can't remember what year, 2019. not the year that shall not be spoke of. You know, like this. But on the other hand, it allows it to be a space where all kinds of alternative facts, and you know, to use the phrase of the previous American administration, can sort of percolate and metastasize. And so it's got that dual process. I think what's clear is that there are substantial and growing political crises for the regime as such. And I use the word regime advisedly, as in not the administration. Do you know what I mean? Like you, and I think there are all kinds of reasons, and that primarily is, I think, the closing down of the space of legitimate kind of discourse pushes some people outside, and you see it in the way that like you know, revisionist myths about the Iranian Revolution circulate, for instance. You know, we were talking about this just before we went live. You know, there is you know, there is a thirst for counter histories of what happened in the run-up to the revolution, precisely because such a limited set of discussions were allowed about that in actual mainstream society. But there are certain crises and challenges for the regime and the administration that I think won't go away. One of which is about that crisis of legitimacy that comes out of the last 5 or 6 years. And I think people are aware of this. Do you know what I mean? People are aware of this, and people within the regime seem to be aware of this. And then the other, I think there's big social crises as well. Do you know what I mean? Largely to do with the fact that, like, you know, there are certain tendencies towards, I mean, a lot of nonsense circulates about how many people in Iran consider themselves Muslims, and you know, in any, however many do or don't, like, the relationship between that and politics is a very complicated thing anyway. Do you know what I mean? But in any case, there is, you know, there is a 30-year process. There is a 30-year process that's been undergone in Iran, which of course has largely modernized the country further, and actually, you know, hugely grown hugely grown what you might call the more modern section of the middle class. So, you know, if you go back to the times of the revolution or whatever, if you go back to 79, there is a huge cultural difference between, you know, leftists whose family have been secular for 2 generations, who are in the Tudeh party, let's say, or the Fedayeen, and revolutionaries of the Islamic persuasion who are often the first in their family to go to university. And that distinction is more or less gone now, I think. So.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I mean, that's it really. I mean, the show is, you know, the show started off on in theatres, but it got shut down obviously because of COVID, and so we made a digital version of it that went has been all kinds of places around the world. It was selected for the Sundance Film Festival in February, and it will carry on being available from a number of online festivals in North America and Europe, hopefully for around about the next year. And if you want any more information on that, you know, it will be on my website, which is javaadalipoor.co.uk, or on Twitter, I'm at Javaad Alipoor.
Javaad, thank you for talking to us at Middle East Monitor Live. And to the audience, I'd also like to thank you. Please join us again next week for another conversation.